prosecutors in Manhattan have reportedly granted President Trump's longtime financial gatekeeper immunity related to the Michael Cohen case. Allen Weisselberg serves as the chief financial officer of the Trump Organization, and according to the Wall Street Journal, he's expected to provide information to prosecutors regarding hush money payments made by the president's former lawyer during the 2016 presidential campaign.
Weisselberg is the latest in a string of Mr. Trump's allies to potentially flip on the president. Earlier today, we reported the CEO of the National Enquirer's publisher, David Pegues, was also reportedly given immunity related to the same case. With more insight, we're joined now on the phone by Loyola Law School professor Jessica Levinson. So, Jessica, what do you make of the news?
Well, I think that this is actually quite big news. And if you look at why Mr. Weisselberg was granted immunity, it's a assumption, I think it's a safe assumption, but it's just an assumption that this is not just to prosecute Michael Cohen for hush money payments, that Mr. Weisselberg is the one who has deep financial insight into not just the Trump Organization, but also the Trump Foundation, which is the president's charitable organization, and also private trusts, which he has managed for decades. So I think Mr. Weisselberg is really key to many of the financial activities of Mr. Trump and his organizations.
So how would he be legally vulnerable then? I know that he sort of knows about the numbers and how the money's being moved, but what would be at risk for him?
Well, what would be at risk for? So the question is basically, why would he have to be? I think why would he have to be granted immunity? Why could he possibly be facing any criminal investigation? And we already know from civil suits by, for instance, the Attorney General of New York, that there is a suspicion that the Trump Organization and the Trump Foundation engaged in a number of financial crimes, including potentially bank fraud, tax fraud. We've heard these terms before. And so Mr. Weisselberg, as the CFO of essentially all things financial dealing with President Trump, could be very vulnerable because he knew about every payment that was made. He knew about every filing to the IRS, for instance, to the SEC. And so my suspicion is that this grant of immunity, which is not given lightly in the Southern District of New York, is not just so you can get Mr. Cohen on campaign finance violations, but it's so that he can provide a wealth of insight into potential financial misdoings in the Trump Organization and the Trump Foundation and the private trust.
Jessica, I don't want to make this as simple as what it sounds like to me, but I'm not a lawyer, so I'll just ask you, could all of this have been alleviated had President Trump just released his tax returns? Are some of the questions that prosecutors and investigators are looking for, would some of those answers have been found in the president's tax returns?
It's entirely possible that some of those answers would be found in the tax return, but my strong suspicion, and again, not actually working in the Department of Justice right now, it's just a suspicion, is that we're not just looking at the information that would be provided on the tax returns. We're looking at all of the information behind the tax returns. We're looking at whether or not we think the tax returns were fraudulently filed. We're looking at all of the original evidence from a variety of corporations, from a variety of nonprofit corporations, from a variety of charitable organizations that went into the filing of those tax returns. So I think the tax returns would be, to use an overused cliche, would really just be the tip of the iceberg. We want to see the whole rest of that iceberg.
And just for our viewers to understand, the granting of immunity by prosecutors to anybody, just explain that process, because if you listen to the president and you listen to some of his surrogates, they've lambasted Michael Cohen, they've lambasted other people that have, provided information to investigators at all levels of all the investigations that are going into President Trump, the Trump campaign, and even the Trump Foundation. But when a prosecutor gives a person immunity, grants them immunity, what is that tool for?
Yeah, that's a great question. So this is something that happens in courthouses throughout America every day. And basically a grant of immunity is a federal prosecutor or a state prosecutor saying to a a witness or a subject or a target, you have information that we need for this case, but you are subject to potential criminal liability yourself. And so if you provide me with this information, I will do something for you. I will say you cannot be prosecuted or you cannot be liable. So it's really an exchange where the person who's granted immunity gets to feel that they are not subject to any type of liability, and the prosecutor gets the information that they likely otherwise would not, and which they need for either this one case or for a variety of cases.
All right, so let me
Jessica, though, there's a high standard for that information, right?
That my follow-up, and sorry, Maria, but my follow-up was going to be, the president has suggested that certain people, like Michael Cohen, are not to be trusted because they are liars.
Yes.
They are proven liars. And so the follow-up to my question is, if you're granting somebody who is proven by some accounts to be an unreliable person, are you doing that, are you granting that immunity because you can, with some degree of certainty, confirm that the information they're providing to you is truthful? Because that's the argument, that Michael Cohen is a liar, right?
It's provable information that is applicable to whatever the case is.
Exactly.
That's such an important question, and it's come up so often this week in light of, as you said, Michael Cohen pleading guilty to 8 different counts, and people are saying, well, yeah, it's Michael Cohen. He doesn't have any credibility. It's a he said. And people said the same thing in the Paul Manafort trial with respect to Rick Gates, his assistant. And they said, well, the whole Paul Manafort trial is based on you believing Rick Gates. And now people can say this with respect to Allen Weisselberg. And I think the response to all of those 3 situations is essentially the same, which is the testimony is useful for federal prosecutors in providing them with a roadmap to find additional evidence. But I think when it comes to all of these 3 individuals who may have varying degrees of minor to massive credibility problems, what the federal prosecutors are looking at is using that testimony to find documentary evidence or other testimony which backs up what they're saying. So with respect to Michael Cohen, I think part of what we're seeing today for what Mr. Weisselberg is essentially knew is it's not a he said. It's a Michael Cohen said and the evidence said and the other testimony said. And so what you see for the grants of immunities, yes, oftentimes absolutely the question is, how can we believe this person? And it's because prosecutors have gone back, looked at their testimony, and found something else to back it up.
How significant is this moment? I mean, we have Cohen pleading guilty. We have Manafort being found guilty. What we haven't talked about at all today is that the district attorney is suing the Trump Foundation. Cohen is connected to that. And now we have sort of the central figure who knows all about how the money has been moved. This has got to be the type of person that can pull all these strings together.
I think the grant of immunity for Mr. Weisselberg is very significant, but I think because of what you just said, which is I think when it comes down to it, it may be that the biggest threat to President Trump is not this investigation into whether or not there's a conspiracy between the Trump campaign and the Russian government, but is actually looking into the financial dealings of the Trump organization and the Trump Foundation. Now, I also think it's important for us to try and define what really significant means. Do we mean legally significant or do we mean politically significant? Because we have seen this president survive a number of weeks with really troubling headlines.
So another question then, and this is something that I think that if you are a strong supporter of President Trump, what you're going to say with all of these developments that have occurred over the last 2 weeks or so is, you see, the president has suggested that this is a witch hunt because it all started with a question, as you pointed out, Jessica, to perhaps a conspiracy or collusion with the Russian government to somehow influence the 2016 election. And look what it's become. It's become this investigation into the president's finances, into the president's affairs, even though the affairs themselves are not the subject of the investigation. It's the monies that were used to pay off or to hush up those affairs. And could somebody conceivably make the argument that this was all an attempt to bring down President Trump because certain people in this country, in government, in the Justice Department did not like the outcome of the 2016 election. Is that a leg to stand on if you are a supporter of the president?
I think if you're a supporter of the president, you can absolutely make that argument. I would say that is legally and factually incorrect. So whenever you have a big federal investigation like the one into the potential interference by the Russian government and potential conspiracy between the Trump campaign and the Russian government, what you do as a federal investigator is you start looking at all of the players involved in that potential conspiracy. And when you're doing that, you can uncover separate and additional wrongdoing. And what you do is exactly what Robert Mueller has done, which is you refer those to different trials, to different proceedings, and that's what we saw with respect to Paul Manafort. That's what's happening with Michael Cohen. That may be, and this is, again, a huge maybe, that may be what happens with respect to the financial issues that Mr. Weisselberg will be able to provide information for. So just because you uncover wrongdoing that is unrelated to the initial question does not mean it's a witch hunt. So, for instance, if two neighbors sue each other and in the course of the depositions you find out that one of the neighbors has a buried body in their backyard, you have to then investigate that buried body. It's not a witch hunt. It's information that you just uncovered.
And back to the whole issue of immunity. Can immunity sort of work across jurisdictions, for lack of a better term? I know this immunity deal has to do with the Southern District here in Manhattan, but we know that the Mueller investigation is watching closely. Could that immunity deal cover him for whatever the Mueller investigation might uncover or might be interested in?
I would say I don't know the specifics of this immunity deal. You could have federal investigators on different cases working together to grant immunity in a very broad sense, or you could have a much more narrow immunity agreement. And so the answer is yes, it could, and I simply don't know what the specifics of this agreement are.
Right.
Well, so we can just tell our audience that our Jeff Pegues has confirmed the information that was first reported by the Wall Street Journal, which is that Mr. Trump's CFO, the Trump CEO, there's so many
CFO,
pieces of breaking news that
Trump
I'm trying to keep
CFO.
Right, Allen Weisselberg, his longtime Trump Organization CFO, has been granted immunity in this probe into Michael Cohen. And that is how they're tied in together, those payments that were made. And so, Jessica, I want to ask you one last question about the way that this is being perceived in the public and by the president himself. First of all, there is this, constitutionally, the president, even if he's mentioned in the documents that Michael Cohen has pled guilty to, cannot be indicted because he's a sitting president of the United States. The question becomes then for those, and the president himself has raised it, the question of impeachment. The president suggested high crimes and misdemeanors, and it's a very nebulous term. What are high crimes and misdemeanors?
So I'm going to actually really respectfully not agree with the question, which is that constitutionally the president cannot be indicted. There's nothing in the Constitution that says the president can't be indicted. The Department of Justice has looked at the structure of the Constitution, has looked at a variety of policy reasons, and has said, we think the better answer is that the president cannot be indicted, but no court has ever weighed in on this. And so I think we're all operating under that assumption, yes. But I think it's important for viewers to know there's a good argument on the other side that our United States Constitution said no man is above the law and that a sitting president could, in fact, be indicted. But to your question of impeachment, I mean, I think it was Lyndon Johnson who famously said a high crime and misdemeanor is whatever Congress says it is at that time. And so this current Congress, given the political makeup of it, I think is very unlikely to go the impeachment route. But after the midterms, if the composition of Congress changes and there is not just the allegation that Mr. Trump was involved in federal election campaign violations, but is also involved in a variety of different financial violations, then you could have Congress voting to impeach, certainly based on these federal crimes. The question becomes, will the Senate, by a 2/3 majority, vote to convict? Currently, I think the answer to that is probably no, and after the midterms, I think the answer to that is probably no, at which point you have the Bill Clinton situation where you've been impeached by the House, but you haven't been convicted by the Senate, and you can remain in office.
So, I just have one last question, Jessica, because it's really, I think, it's something the president has talked about, and I haven't seen it challenged that often. The president suggested in an interview with Fox News that because he would have paid for the silencing of these two women out of his own pocket, that somehow that doesn't make it a crime. Does it?
And let's point out also that that's the sort of final version of this. We've heard other versions of where this money has come from, and I'm sure all of that's going to be factored in, but I think that's a good question, Vlad. The president says that it was his own money that paid the hush money.
Right.
So it's not a crime.
Yeah, that's such an important question, and it's something that the president and Rudy Giuliani have been saying, look, no campaign finance violation. That's not the case. So there's a couple of different problems with this argument. And the president is absolutely correct that candidates are not limited in the amount that they can contribute to their own campaigns. But the problems with these payments are separate and apart from that. First, the way the payments were structured from corporations that Michael Cohen and perhaps Mr. Weisselberg helped set up to Stormy Daniels. So first of all, we have a problem in terms of the vehicle a corporation paying, and then we have a problem of them failing to disclose these payments. And third, we have a problem of essentially actively trying to thwart the campaign contribution and campaign disclosure rules by structuring it as legal services. So I would say, sure, in the abstract, in a vacuum, a candidate can contribute to his or her own campaign, but we have vehicle problems, we have disclosure problems, and we have mechanism problems here.
Well, Jessica Levinson, it's been great talking to you.
We've learned so much.
Yeah, we have. Thank you so much.
Oh, it was a pleasure. Thank you.